Welcome to the Bible Feed podcast, a place of conversations about the Bible and faith in the modern world, where ordinary people come together to help each other understand the Bible better. Let's get started.
It's good to be back on another Bible Feed podcast, and today I'm joined with Jon Davies.
Good evening, Daniel. How are you?
Very good, thank you. Nice to talk to you again, and we've got a really good topic to talk about right now. This topic actually came out of a question that we had from a podcast listener. So if that's any encouragement to any other listener to suggest topics, ask questions, etc., then go for it, because we like to hear from you, and we like to discuss some of those things. So the question that we had was, why are there four Gospels? And it's a very basic question, but actually quite profound, quite fundamental as well. What we're going to do, we're going to tackle this by asking a slightly different question. So the title of this sort of conversation is, why are there differences between the Gospels? And because asking that question will get us towards at least some of the way of working out why there are four Gospels in the first place. And I think if you start there, then you're going to run into the differences very quickly, aren't you? So that's what we're going to tackle, and Jon's here to help me. So let's get into it. And I think what we need to do first, Jon, is to just frame the problem. If it is indeed a problem, the differences. Why is it? Why is it a question? The fact that why are there differences in the gospel? Why is that a question?
So, and it is a good question. I think that is whoever asked it. It's a question I know you have as well, Dan. And I think the first question on a really simple level is, why do the various people who write a kind of history of Jesus, if you want to call it that, why do they record different things? Why don't they record the same thing? I'll give you a very simple example. Only one of the Gospels really tells us anything about Jesus' life as a child. Okay, So that is, at the very least, as an interested person in history or Jesus or anything like that, there's a legitimate question to say, why does only one of them do that thing? If you like. That's the kind of very sort of high level problem, or not problem, question you'd be asking. Yeah. I think on a more critical and maybe foundational level, the question behind this question is often, if you have different records of the life of Jesus that perhaps disagree, so take an example that's often suggested. If the Gospels writers don't know how many women there were at the tomb of Jesus when he was said to have been resurrected, can we trust them with other things, like, for example, that Jesus rose from the dead? So you can move from something quite small and quite detailed, which is about, well, there seems to be this slight difference of the amount of women at the tomb, to going, well, if I can't trust them on that, can I trust them at all, I suppose? And in prep for this, there's one quote that I think is it's a very polarized opinion. I think it's patently wrong. But for example, in Christopher Hitchens' book, God Is Not Great, he says, he describes the Gospels, and he says they're multiple authors, so the people who wrote the Gospels, none of whom published anything until many decades after the crucifixion, cannot agree on anything of importance. And so if, for example, you don't have a working acquaintance with the Gospels per se, and you read that, you'd go, he's got a good point, to be fair. If they can't agree, I can't. It's like anything in history. Oh, report X says this happened. A report Y says something completely different happened. Probably all wrong. I don't know. Can't be trusted.
Who knows?
Is that fair, do you think?
Yeah. So it's a question of trust, isn't it? I suppose you've used that word already. It's, if there are wild discrepancies between these four written accounts that claim to be recording about the things that happened to this man Jesus. If there are these wild differences, then can we trust any of them? Maybe one of them's got it right, but how would we know that? I suppose so. That's the
precisely
stake, isn't it?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and whether or not that's a valid way of looking at it. It's probably a popular way of looking at it, isn't it?
Yeah.
As shown by this book, the quote that you read out.
Yeah, and I think we'll go into in a minute perhaps the kind of the nature of all the differences and so on. But I do personally think that it is a valid question to ask, because at the heart of the Christian faith is this man called Jesus, and as Christians, we believe that he is incredibly special, that he was the Son of God, that he rose from the dead. A lot of that information we get comes from the Gospels. Not all of it by any stretch, and of course there are other documents, but that's really the main source material for this. So I think that is a legitimate question for people to ask. Why are they a bit different? That seems a bit odd. And so I think it is a fair question to ask us.
Yeah, and then that will lead into, why are there four in the first place? Why isn't there one? Or why isn't there indeed 10? Yeah. Okay. So let's that sort of set the case. Let's just think about in terms of scale. What are we dealing with? What are we dealing with first of all in terms of these gospels? We've already said that there's 4 of them, and then what's your general gut feel as to how many type of differences there are really between them?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think in terms of, I guess, the sense to give a size and sense of scale kind of initially, let's take something like the length of the books as a good proxy to see whether they're similar or different. So in terms of words, the first gospel that was probably written, and it's under the name of Mark, and that's got about 11,000 words in the original Greek text that it was probably originally penned in. So 11,000 is one. Then the largest of the gospels is Luke, and that has just over 19,000 words. So it's not double, it's about 80% bigger. Yeah. And then you've got Matthew at 18,000 and John at 16,000. So I think they are different. And before you even get into the material, you've worked out that they're quite differently sized books. I mean, they're not like 1,000 and 78,000, but they are reasonably different in terms of size, and we'll see in a second shape. So I guess to try and go on, there you go.
I was just going to say that my immediate sort of sense there is that they're there or thereabouts. Let's say they're not, like you say, they're not wildly one side of A4 and then another one three tomes. They're kind of similar sort of small short summaries of the life of this person. You kind of think that they ought to be saying the same sort of thing.
I think that's very fair, and I think it would be like comparing, say, biographies today of a famous historical figure like, I don't know, Churchill or someone. You'd probably find that you might have a book on Churchill that's 100,000 words and one that's 200,000 words. Is the same sort of tolerance level, and you kind of expect on any biography of Churchill that they broadly narrate the same kind of things, but maybe from different perspectives. And actually, I would suggest that's probably what you see with the Gospels. But let's dig into that.
Okay, that's good. Yeah.
So, your other question, I think, was how you scale the differences, if you like. Yeah. I think that's actually quite hard to put a kind of numerical value on. But I suppose let's think about it like this. So we can think about the types of differences in a number of different ways. Firstly, might be where they start. So where does the gospel begin and where does the gospel end? And I think you broadly find that they all start and end in slightly different places. So that is a difference straight away. The order that they place events in the main is the same, but there are differences. And we'll see, I think we're going to think about an example of that later. So that you might say, okay, I'm kind of broadly comfortable with that. But then there's other examples where the same incident is recorded in the life of Jesus, different people are said to say the same thing. So in one incident, a particular individual says that thing, and then in the other record, it's their mother who says that thing. Now, on that level, I think you've got different grades, like starting and ending in a different place. You'd be like, okay, but maybe modern biographies would do that. I don't have so much of an issue with that. Order of events broadly being the same but slightly different, you can kind of account for that. But maybe when you've got different people saying the same things, you'd be a bit like, not really sure what's going on there. So I think there are loads of differences between the Gospels, and that has always been acknowledged since the earliest sort of Christian period, that there are these differences and they do exist. Exactly how many there are, I've got no idea. But there are plenty, and I guess that's a place to start.
Yeah, it's unmistakable, I suppose, is the summary. You can't read Matthew and then Mark and then Luke and then John without maybe pausing, scratching your head and thinking, I think I read something like this before. And And
I think that's fair. And I think what you could also get to is you might read Matthew, Mark and Luke and get to a place where you're like, actually, they are really quite similar in many, many ways. They often narrate the same events almost verbatim. And then you get to John and you're like, cool, this is a bit different. So I think even if you, like in your mind, had resolved Matthew, Mark and Luke's differences, you'd then get to John and think this is a little bit different again.
Yeah, okay. So we'll see if we get a chance to talk about that specifically. Let's sort of sketch the scale of what we're sort of dealing with. You already said about the fact that there are sort of the same incidents recorded, but actually someone says something else. Someone says the same thing, but different people say it in different gospels, etc., which is a difference. But actually, that's already highlighted the fact that there are similarities.
Yeah, exactly.
Events, which I think that's worth concentrating on first. I think just try and get a sense of what is the same between what's let's think about that first. That will then help us identify the differences. What's
and
similar?
I think that is a very, very important point. And to that question, that quote I referenced from Christopher Hitchens earlier, who extraordinarily bright man, but on this is just wrong. If you think about kind of the zoomed out view about the Gospels, actually, he said that they don't agree on anything of importance. I'll give you a few things on which every single Gospel says these things, and I'll give you some examples. So, for example, every single one of them calls him Jesus of Nazareth, the Messiah, the Son of God, the Son of Man, Rabbi, King, the Prophet, who came to save, was sent by God, had power, came not to do his own will, and predicted his own death. Every single Gospel says that about Jesus.
Okay.
And then on top of that, there are other acquaintances of Jesus that every single Gospel mention: his mother and brothers, his 12 disciples, Mary Magdalene, Pontius Pilate, Joseph and Arimathea. And some of those people are big characters, like, for example, his disciples. Others are not enormous characters in the record, like Joseph of Arimathea, who only really appears once, but they all mention him. So those are like some examples that they have this consistency. And I think the bigger picture for me, which is important, is the broad narrative of Jesus' life, where he lived, what he did, what he taught, is again recorded in all four. So they all record the same kind of locations, like Galilee and Capernaum and Jerusalem. They all say he was prefaced by a man called John the Baptist. They all claim he was a miracle worker. They all have some core teaching that every single Gospel agrees that he said. He's then opposed by the Jewish and Roman rulers. He's led to Jerusalem. He's tried, he dies, and then he raises from the dead. That's in every single one of them. And many of those little details that I haven't even gone into are exactly the same. So when Hitchens says they agree on nothing of importance, that's a wild overstatement. They agree on the broad narrative of Jesus' life, his friends, acquaintances, even little place names that really we didn't know much about if we didn't have the Gospels, they have complete consistency on. So if you will, my argument would be the Gospels have broad similarity, but they are also very distinctive, in the same way that, for example, if you did have biographies of someone like Churchill or some historical figure, I think you'd expect to see the same thing. If you were talking about Churchill, you'd talk about his time in the war, Thorny Wood, you'd talk about like his time as Prime Minister of the war, like the core events of his life, they'd all mention, but they probably have different cuts at the way that they portrayed Churchill for whatever reason they were writing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and different perspectives as well from different people's point of view who interacted with this person that they're describing, I guess.
Yeah.
So I there's no reason why that shouldn't also be the case in the Gospels, I suppose. There's just one thing, it opens up a bit of a rabbit hole, but one thing that we might want to just spend a minute on is the fact, okay, there are broad similarities between these Gospels, but could it not be that they're all basically have been copying each other? Mark being the first and then the others sort of copying them. Is that a problem? I mean, we're getting into a big area of scholarship which has been going for hundreds of years, effectively, haven't we? Which I'm not going to claim to resolve right now.
No, I don't profess to solve that particular problem. So I guess the question is, did they copy from each other, and is that a problem? So my argument would be there is definitely. It becomes pretty apparent when you read the Gospels, particularly Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that they have some shared material, at least. So whether they copied from each other or whether there was earlier documentation that was around that they used as source material, I think it's actually very hard to know. I think it's a bit of a fool's game, personally, that it's actually very, very hard to gauge. And actually, at the start of Luke's Gospel, he implies that as part of his research to write about the life of Jesus, he is aware of other documents circulating. So I think, like, whether they copied from each other or not, they definitely seem to use source material that's similar. However, I don't think you can have it both ways. You can't on one hand say they were just copying each other, and then on the other hand say, oh, but they violently disagree.
Yeah.
That you can't have those both together. You have to account for both factors, that there's similarities and differences. My suggestion would be they use similar source material and cut their material according to the narrative they were trying to show. We'll maybe come on to that in a second.
Yeah.
But I think this question of whether they copied each other, they may have done, but if they've got differences, you can't have that. You can't have your argument go both ways. You can't moan that they differ and then say, oh, but they just copied each other.
Yeah, I think that's a valid point there, isn't it? And I suppose that begs then the question, doesn't it, as to, well, why are there differences if there were good and numerous sources that, for example, Luke could turn to and talk about? why is it? That's what we need to.
And just to build on that, if you could have a view that the Gospels were just written to prove to people that Jesus was this person, and that they're very sort of evangelistic documents, and they're trying to convince you of their cause, and therefore, well, what you could say is, well, maybe a later writer would copy bits from an earlier document. But if he was doing that, why would they then change bits? Because presumably that would give you less credibility if you're starting to change things that they've done. But they seem very comfortable with having a different view on certain things, and that bit I think is really important. That actually, my argument would be that the differences in the Gospels are actually part of their credibility, that they don't feel the need to smash it all together and be exactly consistent. They very, very comfortably will have slightly different cuts of how things happen or whatever, and we'll see that in a second.
Okay, so let's go into sort of some more of these differences then to try and work out, diagnose, why they are there. Broad similarity, which we've established, but nonetheless, lots of differences, like you've said, and at a different scale. But so you've already talked about the start, where they start. There's birth narratives, aren't there? So, for example, Mark, there is no birth narrative at all. Matthew's got the wise men coming to see Jesus. Luke's got the shepherds, and then John is just totally different. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, etc. So some sort of philosophical, really profound few verses there. So that's extremely different.
Very much so.
Especially, putting material in Matthew and then Luke alongside each other. I think that shows a huge difference. And then again, going to the end, we've got the number of people at the tomb. The women at the tomb were. So this is the tomb of Jesus when he was supposedly resurrected. So how many women went there? Were there angels in the tomb or not? Who did Jesus first appear to? Where were they? In Jerusalem and Galilee, and all these different things. So there's quite a few different things that are different and fairly fundamental. So let's just try and categorize them, I suppose. Have you got any way of doing that?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think perhaps the way I find it most useful to think about the Gospels is that once you have accepted that they are individual books, which I think is a really, really important part, much like any other book, they have a narrative to tell themselves. So each gospel has a purpose. And I think sometimes what we can get in danger of doing is we because of probably of our Western mindset, we kind of almost want to bring them all together into a big kind of super gospel and get them all to kind of join up and then paint this kind of mega gospel that tells us everything. But they were written as individual documents, and we should take them on that account. I think once we start to do that, it's a very helpful step in understanding what they're doing. So you mentioned, for example, the fact that there's different birth narratives, and the example that they're different cuts at the resurrection as to exactly what seems to happen at different points. So I think it's very hard to answer kind of why a specific gospel just does that thing without thinking about how that particular document works in toto, if you will. And I think it would be the same. Let me give you another analogy. Let's say there was a book written about Churchill, and it starts his life. It starts the narrative about Churchill when he becomes prime minister just before the war, and it carries on. It largely details that. It would become fairly apparent to me that the purpose of that biography was to really focus on his political leadership, if you like.
Yeah.
There might be another narrative which is written about Churchill, which really majors on the relationship he had with his dad, which people say was really formative in his younger years, and the kind of the early life of Churchill. And as soon as you kind of tap into what that biography is trying to do, you've got a handle on why it might be recording certain incidents. I think it's no different with the Gospels. I'm not trying to compare Jesus and Churchill, but you see what I'm saying.
Yes. So Churchill is a complex, rounded character, as indeed every single person is.
Yeah.
And so he would have had a political face, a political drive, but he also would have had a different life backstory as well.
Exactly that.
Which is another facet of his person. That's basically what you're saying, isn't it?
Precisely that.
Yeah.
And I think then, so take Mark, which is probably the gospel I've probably spent the most time with.
Okay.
And that gospel doesn't mention anything about his birth.
Yeah.
And it's quite interesting. And it ends in a really strange way at the end of the Gospel of Mark.
Yeah.
So again, what that I think starts to get you doing is to start tapping into what is the Gospel of Mark trying to show. And when you read Mark's Gospel, for example, early on in the Gospel of Mark, it uses one word really often, and it's the word that would be translated into English something like immediately or quickly or straight away. And you get the impression that actually the Gospel of Mark is almost racing to get you to the point where something big's going to happen. And then the narrative really slows down, and that's actually a period in the middle of Jesus's ministry where he's talking to his disciples about what he's going to go through and what discipleship looks like, what following him means.
Okay.
And then it slows down even more in the last week. But you get, it's like if you imagined on a graph the pace of the narrative, it sort of starts off at like lightning speed. It doesn't seem to have any need to talk about anything, any of the backstory. It's straight into, now Jesus started his ministry and this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. And then you breathe for a bit and you think, where are we? And it's like got you right into the action. Maybe in a similar way to the church example, it just starts with his life as prime minister in the war. Like big events are majored on. And so I think in the particular context of Mark, the birth story of Jesus, Mark didn't, I would argue, didn't choose to include that because it wasn't relevant to the narrative he was talking about. That's not to say Jesus wasn't born, because clearly he was, but that bit wasn't perceived as being important in the force of the narrative that Mark is getting at. In this case, I think it's all about the identity of Jesus as it happens. But so that, I think, once we can start to tap into the vein of what the purpose of the documents are, about which bits are included or not included, starts to make more sense, I would argue. And purpose, the purpose of the gospel, is very useful to understand the selection of the events. Does that make sense so far? And then I might talk about historicity in a second.
Yeah, that does make sense. And I'm sort of thinking about Matthew as you talk through that, because Matthew's the gospel probably that I've spent most time in, but more than the others. And it's different from Mark in a big way, isn't it? So you've got you've got a big genealogy right at the start. The book of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And it's all about who the person is, where he's come from, and his fulfillment of these Old Testament scriptures that people knew about and were waiting for. And that's what he then goes to show. And he the things in Matthew's gospel right at the start seem to echo the life of Moses, so Old Testament prophet. So you've got a huge sort of Old Testament root to the gospel of Matthew. So much so that it's structured around 5 collections of Jesus' sayings, with 5 sort of discourses. And did he say all those things in one go throughout his life and never say anything else any other time? But, actually, no, probably. You get bits of his sayings in other parts of Luke and scattered around. But what Matthew's trying to show something, isn't he? I think that's what he's doing. And
I think that's fair. And I think actually with the birth narratives, that understanding of Matthew, which I think is completely right, Matthew has a big thing about how Jesus is like Israel of old, like the son, like Israel was described as being God's son, and they go through these set of experiences that ultimately they fail. And I think what Matthew is doing is saying, actually, this individual Jesus, where Israel failed, Jesus has succeeded in following God faithfully. And it's a really pointed message to, I think, the largely maybe Jewish, non-Jewish readers, that this sort of nation of Israel as it was, they couldn't sort of just put their trust in this kind of national identity. They had to follow God and love God just like Jesus did. And in that context, the fact that Jesus is then in Matthew shown to be in Egypt and coming out of Egypt is exactly what happened at the start of Israel. That completely makes sense why Matthew would include that. Is it as relevant in Mark when his narrative is about something else? No, it's not. So it's not included. Does that mean that they're kind of wildly divergent? No, it's about selection. And I think that purpose point really starts to help understand. That's not to say everything can be explained away through that. There are still some tensions, but it does help give you a framework to understand in which these differences exist.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, it starts begging the question about, well, have they just, inserted different things like, oh, we want him to go to Egypt now, so he can be like Israel or be like Moses or whatever. And then so that then becomes a question we've got to think about. So you said about moving on to sort of historicity, and this leads straight on to that, actually, I think.
And maybe we just define historicity. I use that as a poor word. Basically, that I guess the word I think means like the extent to which a document is broadly historically true. Is that fair?
That's how I use it. Yeah.
Okay. So, and I think maybe we use the example of the kind of the tomb incidents as an example of this. I mentioned that at the start. So if you have a Bible, if you looked at the end of, say, Matthew, you would find it describes after Jesus was said to be after he died, he's then placed in a tomb with that man Joseph Arimathea I mentioned earlier. And in Matthew, for example, we're told chapter 28 verse 1, after the Sabbath, as it began to dawn towards the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to look at the grave. Okay, so that's one record. In Mark chapter 16 verse 1, when Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome bought spices. So you've now got 3 women. In Luke, I think you have, let's have a look, Luke chapter 24, and these are all they're describing the same incidents. This is different to what we were talking about earlier about the birth narratives. They are recording what we perceive to be exactly the same thing. In Luke chapter 24, I don't know if it tells us exactly how many women there are. It just says they, so I don't know that we know exactly how many women are. Sorry, verse 10, Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary the mother of James, and also the other women with them. So you've now got more women. And then you go to John and you're thinking, well, am I going to get 15 women here? And you've just got one again. At this time, it's just Mary. So John chapter 20 and verse 1, now on the first day of the week came Mary Magdalene, came early to the tomb. So on that level, we've now got lots of, the same incident is being recorded and a different amount of women are recorded in each time. Is that fair? I think that's a fair reading of what those verses seem to say.
Yeah, I don't think any one of them agree on the number of women.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So on one level, what I think it would be a real push to say is because they don't agree on the number of women, therefore the event just simply didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
That would be pushing the evidence far too far one way. I think in actual fact, what it would probably say is actually very good evidence that definitely some women turned up at a tomb in the life of Jesus. Exactly how many, I think we then have to be careful about exactly what's going on. And again, going back to this point around purpose, I think that there's probably reasons in why each gospel uses the women in the way it does. Now, that's not to say that we can kind of just explain that all away, but there is examples in the text that imply that maybe it's not just those women that are there. So while we're in John chapter 20, it just talks about Mary being there. Mm-hmm. And then in verse 2, it reads as if it's just her. So she ran and came to Simon Peter, the other disciple whom Jesus loved. This is John 20 verse 2, and said to them, they have taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him. Mm. So in the record, you're saying like, I thought she was on her own, but then she says we. What's going on there? And my suggestion would be, and I think this happens, a scholar called Michael Lacone has done some interesting work about how these kind of tools were used in the time. I think what's going on is that there's almost like a spotlight that's been placed onto Mary for some reason that I actually haven't got quite to the bottom of, but I think there's a theme around Mary Magdalene in the back end of John, and it's just focusing on her experience with the risen Jesus. And that's all that's important. Now, does that mean there weren't other women there? Well, there clearly were, because she alludes to it. But does John feel the need to tell us exactly who those women were? He doesn't. And so in that context, I think you can probably, if you spend enough time, you'll probably be able to understand why they're all using different women and how they're being used. Does it prove that Jesus didn't raise the dead? Not at all. Do we know exactly how many women were there? Probably not, but we've probably got a pretty good guide if we work our way through. But the purpose of those gospels is really helpful to understand what's going on with why people recorded. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it does, definitely. And doesn't Mike Lacona, he in his work that he's done on this, he refers to the Plutarch's Lives, which
that's it.
Yeah, and how that even the same author in writing different lives, concentrating on the Roman Republic, and how the characters interact, he basically observes the same sort of phenomenon going on.
Yeah. And I think the word he uses is telescoping, which is quite a nice visual picture that almost in certain narratives, the writer of this particular gospel gets his telescope out and just focuses on one character. Yeah. And I think actually in many novels and things, I'm not the right person to say this, but you use this as like a narrative tool to draw out certain characters and make the audience more relate to them and that kind of thing. So I don't think it's odd, and certainly wasn't uncommon in the era in which it was written. And once you realise that, you kind of think, well, actually, that does seem a very normal thing to do. Yeah. And actually, does it disprove anything? Do you think suddenly, they're all talking nonsense? No, it just means they're telling you slightly different things, slightly different angles for particular reasons. And what's the point? Some women were at the tomb with Jesus. Like, that's the key thing that you get from all of them. But each gospel will have a reason for focusing on them in different ways.
Yeah. And once you think about all this, you realise that history is never objective entirely, is it? We like to think that we are all the time, and we've got some modern methodology when we talk about history in a way that's different from ancient times, but even so, we all will write about history with a certain amount of bias and a certain amount of what we're trying to interpret and show. with the evidence that we're showing. So yeah, it's totally normal, actually, isn't it?
And actually quite reasonable.
Yeah.
If you think about what you're trying to do, and the gospel writers, let's make it clear, they never claim to be like independent, like academic historians. They're completely invested in the Jesus movement. They want to convince you that Jesus is the Messiah.
Yeah.
So, and if they,
that's John later on in that chapter.
Exactly, he says, I want you to believe that Jesus is the Son of God.
Yeah.
And so they could have just copied each other and made sure it all aligned. And then in a way, for some people, that would have been easy to believe. They choose not to do that because they're very comfortable with it. They think this is a helpful way of us understanding more about God.
Yeah, yeah. And just sort of a little bit longer on this sort of avenue, the fact that there are these sorts of differences, like number of women at the tomb, or slightly different wording of what Jesus said on the cross, or things like that. Is that also, or could it also reflect different sources? The way that the oral tradition of the things that Jesus said and did has come down. Is that fair?
I think that's entirely valid, and I think that's exactly how you would expect history to be written as well. Now, as Christians, different people have different models as to how these documents are written, so do historians. But as soon as you account for the fact that there's probably clearly some source material on view, and whether it's passed down, I mean, in early church history, there's a view that Peter was a key person who gave some information to Mark. Whether that's true or not, I guess it highlights that there's different people involved in passing on these narratives about Jesus. And different people have slightly different memories and way of recording things. So that, of course, that seems like a very valid way to help understand why there's these sort of different perspectives on there as well as the ultimate compilations.
Yeah. So you've got two prongs, haven't you? You've got the fact that to some extent there's different sources, and then also you've got the different purpose that they're both writing. So
yeah, and I guess for those people who are listening who are Christians, they will also have a belief in the inspiration of Scripture and how God works with writers. Many different people have different views of that. God seems very comfortable, as he kind of clearly says at the start of Luke, that they use these sources. Exactly how that happened, I wouldn't profess to know, but I think we have got these two different avenues, like you say, that clearly account for these different perspectives, and that's helpful, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and through these, I suppose if you're latching onto the purpose of each gospel, you're therefore then latching onto, if you have a conviction that this is an inspired word of God, then you're getting towards what God has actually inspired.
Precisely
the
precisely
purpose of these words and the purpose of the message of these narratives. So yeah, you're actually getting closer to it, aren't you? So
I think so.
Yeah. Okay. So let's just think where we've got to. We've got these four gospels. We've seen that they have a lot in common. You sort of listed out a load of different things, didn't you? That talked about how Jesus, what he was referred to, his title, and the broad outline of his life. So that's really helpful. We've come across some differences. Lots of different types of differences, but we've seen that actually there's pretty good evidence for historicity when you think about it in one sense. On top of that, there's the fact that each gospel writer isn't there just to tell you everything that happened. They've got different purposes, and we should therefore expect these gospels to be different. And I think that once we've got onto the fact that there are different reasons for writing, I suppose we've got a step towards answering that initial question, haven't we? The original question: why are there four gospels?
Yeah.
I guess we're not actually fully answering that. I mean, that would take a long time, wouldn't it? To really drill down into why each gospel is presenting a certain facet of Jesus in a certain way. But that's would you say that's basically the?
I think that's a very fair summary, and perhaps we should do why are there specifically four on a separate podcast, because I think that one is what we've basically said is there's good reasons to think that why there would be a number of them. We haven't explained why there's four. And actually, I don't know that I know the answer, but I've got a few ideas. But maybe we'll do that separately. We could do that. And I suppose another avenue as well is why aren't there 10? Because why aren't there later gospels that didn't end up as sort of authoritative? Why aren't they there as well? That's a whole other question, isn't it? But yeah, okay. So we've got all of those things. I just want to think about something a bit more specific, because the number of women at the tomb, yes, okay, we're telescoping on an individual, that seems fine, but then there are things that are still quite surprising
to me as a modern reader, and I guess to many other modern readers. So, for example, we've got the account of Jesus going into the temple, not liking what he sees, and clearing it out. Getting rid of all the money changers and all the people selling all the animals for sacrifices and so on. And you get that in Matthew chapter 21, Mark 11, Luke 19, and it's in the final week before his crucifixion. But in John, you get the same story, but it's in John chapter 2, right at the start, beginning of his ministry, and he goes in clearing out the temple. So, is that taking it a step too far? What should we be cautious about John, or what do we make of these sorts of things?
And that is a very valid question. What I'll probably do here is I'll try and make the problem worse before I try and suggest what I think might be going on, if that's okay. So take the example of Jesus clearing out the temple. Actually, when you look at the way that incident is recorded between Matthew and Mark, who, to your point, Dan, actually both record it broadly at the same period in the last week of his, the week prior to when he died, what you actually find is that Matthew and Mark kind of record that incident in slightly different order themselves. Okay. So we might think, oh, well, it's all the same, but it's not. When you look in the details, you've got the order of events of what happened. So in Mark's gospel, which we think is probably the first one to written, Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey. He then curses a fig tree, and then he goes in to this temple and kind of clears out the people who are doing banking and stuff and using extortion. Then he discusses the fig tree incident again, and then there's a conversation. In Matthew's incident, the fig tree incident and Jesus in the temple are flipped round. Okay, so you might say, oh, it's easy, John, because you've got Matthew, Mark, and Luke the same, and it's John that's the problem. But actually, I would say, well, even when you look at just Matthew and Mark, there's a tension there. Yeah. So I think, so I've made the problem worse. My suggestion would be that I think sometimes when we come to these questions, we come with a very Western perception that we need to have events ordered in a chronological order, that even in modern history, we don't always conform to. So, for example, I've got behind me David Cameron's autobiography. In there, he also groups things into themes where he talks about maybe his relationship with China over time, and he buckets them together. So my suggestion would be that I think the Gospels are quite comfortable moving events around in time. You see it in the micro, in that incident between Mark and Matthew in terms of when things happen. But I think you probably do also see it in the macro. And you actually alluded to this earlier, Dan, when you were talking about Matthew's gospel. Yeah. Matthew 8 and 9, there's a series of events and miracles that actually I think probably historically are drawn from all different parts of his ministry. And if you look in Luke and Mark and find the parallel records, they're all dotted around and they're collated. So my suggestion would be, and again, it doesn't explain all of the differences, and I don't ever profess to do so, but the Gospels seem more comfortable than we might be intuitively moving events around in different orders, probably for thematic reasons, back to our point around purpose. So I am comfortable that one suggestion could be that actually John has relocated that incident at the start of his book. It could, of course, mean Jesus did that twice. I think that's probably unlikely historically, personally, but that is a possibility. And I think as soon as you account for the fact that you have got slightly different orders of events, you're of necessity accepting that the Gospels don't write in exactly the same chronological order. As soon as you've accepted that and that they're comfortable doing so, you've got to buy into that, accept that they might do it with slightly larger events as well.
I suppose thoughts on that? I suppose it's a case of expectations, isn't it? So if you come into these narratives expecting them to give you this sort of almost cold, hard description of things that happened, then you're going to struggle, because you're going to find actually that they seemingly don't, and therefore you've got a choice in front of you. Do we throw them away because they're not actually doing what I expect them to do? But actually what you're trying to say, and I value as well, is that we should change our expectations, because we've already seen that these are Gospels, that these are narratives that have purpose. They've got something that they're trying to tell you about this person, Jesus, each of them, broadly the same, that they're trying to tell you about this special person, and that he's good news, and that he's ushering in a kingdom, and there's broad things, but they're telling you these things slightly differently, with different facets and different perspectives, and whether you should follow him. And so once you've done that, then actually it doesn't matter. They're not trying to tell you chronologically how things happened. I
think that's exactly right. And I think actually, that you can analyze that from two different ways. One is if you looked at other documents at the time, biographies that were written at the time, which I sometimes call by kind of more clever people than I, but like bios, like Greco-Roman biographies, they do exactly the same kind of things.
Yeah.
So in that context, it wasn't unsurprising. I'd actually argue that the Hebrew scriptures do the same things at different points in time. If you compare Chronicles and Kings, so it, like, in the historical situ in which they were written, it's actually quite normal. We're just looking at it from a much different vantage point. And sometimes, again, I think even in the modern era, biographies and things would be written like that. So it sometimes feels that when this question is framed, particularly from a very negative slant, we almost expect more of these four gospels from the first century than we do of either contemporary records today or contemporary records then, or the kind of ideological, like, context of the Old Testament. That's a massively unfair burden to bring to a particular document, which is, I think, what we just alluded to.
Yeah, not what it claims to be as well. So,
exactly.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Just on your Matthew 8 and 9 that you pulled out, that just made me think of perhaps the reason why those things are pulled together is, I think, each of those healing and miracles that are grouped together there, it's really about whether Jesus has authority, and whether he's got authority to forgive sins, whether he's got authority to claim that, the kingdom is at hand, and all these sorts of things. And it's right off the back of the first discourse in Matthew, which ends with the people wondering at this teacher who spoke as if he had authority, not like the scribes. And that's exactly what Matthew says. So then you get a collection of stories that demonstrate that, he does have authority to say these things.
Absolutely right.
Then, and then there's another block of sayings, and then another block of,
and
tie-in.
Just on that, in Matthew 8 and 9, it seems to me, at least, that when you compare the incident there with Mark and Luke, on some occasions, Matthew chooses not to give people a name, and their names are really important in the other Gospels. So Jairus is specifically told Jairus by name, and I can't remember what the other one is, Legion maybe by name.
Yeah.
In Matthew, they're kind of anonymized, and you're like, why would he do that? But in that context, it makes a lot of sense. Matthew's pulled these events together to prove that Jesus has authority over anyone who's got sickness and disease.
Yeah.
So actually, it's better not to give them the name, to illustrate they're just kind of representative members of the human race who Jesus can heal. That's an amazing thing to see when you see it. Does that mean that kind of Matthew got it wrong, or like he misquoted Mark? Well, maybe, but it's a much richer view of how an ancient author would work, and it tells you something about the life of Jesus, that he's there to heal them, he could heal them, and in so doing, it tells us stuff about how he can relate to all of us, whatever our background and situation. It's much more powerful as well.
Yeah, and that it's worth listening to his teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, because he's got authority to say it, which is the heart of Matthew's gospel. So, we could probably go on and on, but I feel like we've got to a point where we've sort of, sketched out quite a few reasons why there might be differences, and reasons why we should expect there to be differences, and not feel threatened or worried by that, but actually be comfortable by it, and to be, to some extent, to embrace it, and to search for the reason why, which then really gets onto why are there four gospels, what is each individual purpose, and what is that trying to tell us. So I think we've got there. What do you reckon? Is there anything else you?
No, I think your last point is actually very good. I think sometimes, particularly if we've been brought up in a Christian environment and we might have put on the bookshelf a harmony of the Gospels, the natural desire is to kind of weave them together. And I think that's really, it's fine, of course, if we want to do that, that's cool. But it's missing so much. And that if God, let's accept that there's a God and he wrote how to write this book called the Bible through various people. If he'd wanted one massive super gospel, he could have written that. He hasn't. He's written four. And actually, that's much more powerful, I think, for us from a personal point of view to try and engage them. So I would certainly encourage anyone listening to investigate the Gospels, of course, together, but particularly looking at their theme themselves. And it's much more rewarding, I think.
Yeah, excellent. Okay. Well, thank you very much, John.
No, thanks.
It's been a good conversation. I always feel with these sorts of conversations that there's lots of different avenues to go off and explore, maybe for subsequent episodes, and it'd be really good to talk about more and more of these things. But thank you very much, and thank you everyone listening. It's been really quite an exciting conversation. And like I said right at the start, if you have any questions or topics that you want us to think about, well, get in touch, because actually we love to hear that, and there's a good chance that we'll deal with them, and we'll think about those things and talk about these Bible topics, because it's always great fun and it's good to do it in community. So So if you have any comments or any thoughts on this, get in touch. You can go to biblefeed.org and you can get in touch there. So thank you, everyone, and see you next time.
Cheerio.
You've been listening to the Bible Feed podcast. Thanks for joining us. We're always keen to hear what you think and hear your questions on subjects you'd like us to discuss. Get in touch with us on our Facebook page or send us a message from our webpage at biblefeed.org and be part of the journey.